So today I am making a top. Here I am going to be, draping the fabric. I've never done this before, it was my first time, so it obviously isn't perfect. And when I get to the back, I don't have enough fabric to fully extend it all the way. But besides that, there are three pieces. One that's cut on a fold in the center, and then two on the sides, and then one basically a rectangle piece in the back. Here is the pattern that I draped and then cut, and then I put it on wrapping paper, and I'm cutting out using the lining here using a t-shirt. I did have to try to figure out where to put it a couple times. After this, I just traced around it with the fabric chalk, and then I cut around it with a seam allowance. My seam allowance is not perfect, but I was going to rely on the fabric chalk to give me my lines to show. And this is the centerpiece that I'm cutting out. It's on the fold. It's the only piece that is on the fold with the pattern that I used. I also had to use the sleeves because I ran out of fabric for the side. Here I'm pinning on the side piece to the front piece, and you have to kind of push it around with the pins to try to get it to fit because it's on a curved piece to a mostly straight piece, which is how the pattern ended up. I pinned all the rest of the pieces together, and then I sewed them all down with a straight stitch. After I had finished sewing the side pieces, I looked and I saw that there was quite a bit of difference in between the seam allowance, and eventually I would realize that I actually had sewn the back pieces on backwards, and I had to take them off and resew them. Here I'm just ironing out my seam allowance. This is before I had to change the back pieces, so they look a little different. Again, with the curved pieces, you have to kind of push the fabric around to get it to iron so it lays flat. And here I'm cutting off my seam allowance. I'm sewing the boning channels down into here because the top wasn't as structured as I would have liked it to be with 2 layers of fabric. And then here is the sleeve pattern. I didn't actually have a pattern for this, I just kind of sewed a big bell shape. Here I'm ironing down the seam allowance for when I sewed the 2 straight edges of the sleeves together. And then I ended up actually taking a lot of the sleeve off because I realized that it would be too big and it would take too much to kind of sew all the way around that and make that a channel for an elastic. Here I'm cutting the fabric for the ruffles, and I wanted it to be around 4 times the length of the bottom of the shirt, so I used extra fabric and I cut these 4 of these strips out, and then I sewed them together and then ironed the seam allowance down. I cut out the pattern in the facing fabric and then sewed it together the same way I did the lining. And I cut 2 small semicircles on it to fit in the sleeves after I pinned the lining and the facing together. Here I'm sizing a ribbon for the top because I had originally tried to sew around it and hem it, but it didn't work really well since it was a curve, so I decided to use ribbon. And since it was pretty big, I just cut it in half so I could save ribbon, and I pinned it shiny side down onto the fabric because I wanted the matte side to show up. I ironed the ribbon down so it was almost like a bias tape, and so I could sew it on right to the fabric. I sewed it around the top edge of the fabric, not the bottom edge. I used the method where you put the elastic onto a safety pin and then threaded it through the ribbon casing that I had just sewn, and then you pull it closed and it should runch up the outer edge, creating the puff part of the sleeve. After sewing the elastic down to the ribbon, I pinned the sleeve to the facing of the top, and then I used a straight stitch and sewed that down just so I wouldn't have all the pins there when I put the actual lining and the facing together. I sewed around the entire lining and facing, just the top of it though, because I needed to sew down the ruffles to the bottom, and the sides needed to have a different closure on the back that I was going to use. I just used a straight stitch and tried to avoid the sleeves as much as I could, except for where it was already sewn. After turning the top inside out, I top stitched the top hem down so the fabric would stay in place, and then measured the bottom and gathered the strip to be the same size as that. I pinned the ruffle down and then sewed it down to the facing right sides together, and then top stitched that down and hand sewed the lining in. I also sewed an elastic around the edges of the sleeves with a zigzag stitch and then the edges of the top down. I made some loops with the rest of the ribbon and a long strap with the blanket stitch to act as a closure for the back. I went over them a couple times so they would stay, and added boning to the top so it would stop bowing in after I tried it on, and re-top stitched that also. I zigzagged the edges of the ruffle and the sleeves so I didn't have to hem it because I was being lazy, and then the top was basically finished. Here's a really awkward photo of me wearing it. There are a couple of things I'd like to change on the top, like the puckering at the top and probably rehemming the sleeves and the bottom, but overall I think it turned out pretty well.